Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Legend Makers. I'm your host, Phil, and with me today is special guest, my brother/roommate. Over the course of these episodes, we're going to explore some popular stories we love and dive a little bit more deeply into the way that those stories can act as guides or tools for understanding the world around us. We're going to be drawing on a combo of philosophy, science, and religious thought to better explore those ideas. But at the end of the day, we don't really mean this to be an educational podcast. It's just for asking questions, starting interesting convos, and having fun. Today's topic is one that we've been talking about doing since the very beginning of thinking about this podcast.
Very true.
We went back and forth a lot on exactly what the topic or the point, like the thematic discussion was going to be, because I think these movies have a lot to work with. We always say that the MCU has a few technically perfect installments. Those being movies that...
Well, they stand on their own as movies.
They stand on their own as movies, and they achieve exactly what they set out to do in the genre and the story structure that they set up for themselves. And Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 is one of those movies. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is a deeply imperfect movie, but a perfect sequel. And I think that it adds a lot of character and emotional depth to the story that Volume 1 just didn't have the space to give. Volume 1 was a very grounded movie, and it did a very excellent job. Like, for what it was, It was very grounded. It did an excellent job completely expanding the world of the MCU into space and making it feel really lived in and tangible and relatively normal despite its insanity. Volume 2 did not do any of that. It completely took it in the direction of comic book colors come to life. Space monster falling out of a rainbow portal, spewing, glitter everywhere.
Yeah.
Everything felt kind of surreal and uncanny valley, especially when they were on Ego's planet. And the movie, has slightly awkward pacing, janky dialogue in places. It's a lot more overtly a comedy. And so the reason we're talking about this is because Volume 2 is not a universally loved or praised film. Yet, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 was the movie that really got me invested in Marvel again after years of total apathy. I fell in love.
For me, when I first saw it, I was really unimpressed. And it took me, I think, like a week of thinking about what the movie was trying to do and trying to unpack its actual story until I realized, wow, this movie is actually really good. It's just, it makes so many strange technical choices that it becomes off-putting when you're watching it at the first time, when you don't know what to expect.
Honestly, I had a really good time the first time.
Because my template was the first movie going in. And I like the first movie a lot more than you do. You did, I think.
Yeah, now it's one of my favorite movies. Like, if we're talking comfort movies, Guardians 1, every time I watch it, serotonin directly to the center of the brain.
The reason is because you know all these things about the characters that you get from the second movie. Whereas when the first movie came out, a lot of the structures, although very unique and fun, felt pretty tropey, I think.
Yeah, I think for me, and again, this is a problem that the MCU has perennially. Because they play the long game, they will set up a story that at face value feels like it could very easily be a boring rehash of older tropes that one has seen before and are not particularly interesting or leaning towards being sexist or are, this or that or the other. And the characters are not given the opportunity in the first installment to be as three-dimensional as they can be, even though technical aspect of whatever the film is pretty good. And then a sequel or a next installment will come out and add a lot of depth to the character 4 years down the line.
Yeah.
And then you'll be like, oh my god, I can see what they were planning in that first installment. And then every time you go back to it, it's wonderful. Speaking of technically perfect movies, Captain America, The Winter Soldier, flawless film from a technical perspective. When I first saw it, I didn't feel any of the emotional beats because the characters had not had the opportunity in their previous films to be developed to the point that would really get that emotionality.
Especially with a character like Bucky, you had
Especially
no
with a
reason to
character
care at that point.
He had pretty much no development prior to that movie, or even in that movie.
Yeah.
However, now with Falcon and the Winter Soldier, he is a wonderfully developed character, and going back, you care a lot. Guardians 1 and 2 has a similar energy.
Well, and I think both films center very strongly around Peter Quill's character.
Yes.
And we're going to get into why I really liked what the second one did with him.
Peter Quill, my beloved. My beef with the takes of the internet is long-standing and convoluted, but that bizarre period of time after Infinity War where everyone hated on Peter Quill for having a normal human reaction to being told that, like, a person he loved dearly had been murdered in cold blood was just so baffling to me.
Well, I think what was funny is because up until that point, the MCU was pretty mainstream, but it was kind of jarring to have, like, the Wall Street Journal have an article about why Peter Quill is the worst.
It particularly bothered me because Guardians as an MCU property has never been one of its monetarily high stakes one. Like, it hasn't been its mainstream uber popular, like, everyone cares about these characters.
Yeah.
And so it was particularly irritating that, like, people who had no context for the characters, had these opinions about why Peter especially was, like, this horrible evil who, you know, ruined everything for the whole universe. To this day, people believe that. I promised myself I wouldn't rant about this, and inevitably, here we are. So for this episode, what we're going to do is, given all of that, we will be referencing Guardians 1 because obviously there is definitely a lot of deliberation and conscientious setup of character that James Gunn did in that movie that then followed into and was expanded upon in Volume 2. But thematically speaking, I think a lot of what we're going to be explicitly referencing is in Volume 2. And then also, as a kind of contrast or parallel, we just recently rewatched Daredevil Season 3, which, speaking of perfect installments, that season is the perfect superhero show. Best season of TV ever done. We realize right now that Daredevil Season 3 and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 are very tonally different, and one might be wondering, why would you talk about those two things at the same time? We promise it'll make sense in a little bit.
Yeah.
So the thesis of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, in my read, and I've said in previous episodes that I think that these movies have a lot of value. So people who have experienced hurt and trauma and abuse are 1, deserving of love, 2, capable of love, and 3, responsible for loving. This isn't something I've just pulled out of thin air. I know James Gunn has spoken about it before. Very deliberately, this is what he wanted to explore in these movies. He wanted to explore a group of characters who are recovering from a lot of particularly childhood trauma and trying to be the best versions of themselves that they can be while still, you know, having a lot of flaws and making a lot of mistakes. I think that the reason that this is a relevant and valuable topic to reflect on is because in real life, traumatic experiences, big or small, are honestly a lot more common than you might think across a diversity of populations. 78% of Canadians have experienced a traumatic experience in their lifetime, and for the US it's about, I think, 70%.
I wanted to maybe go into a little bit why we really like Guardians 2 and why we felt that it really added a lot to the characters that were introduced in the first movie.
When we first saw the movie, you had some very interesting reflections on the themes in Peter's arc and what it represented to you, like what you read out of it, that I hadn't noticed, and when you told them to me, it kind of blew my mind, and that's the only way I see the movie now.
In my reading of the movie, in the first Guardians movie, Peter is introduced as kind of a classic leading man character. Suave, he's charismatic, but he's funny, and he's a little goofy in a lovable way. But at the end of the day, you know, he's the hero of the story. And especially towards the beginning of the film, there is a very strong emphasis narratively on him being kind of a ladies' man, and he kind of isn't ever emotionally tied down. You know, you first meet him, he's betraying his faction of the Ravagers. Yondu's upset with him. He's kind of off on his own. there are all these classic elements of like this space outlaw. Obviously,
well, yeah, we were talking about archetypes last week, and Peter Quill at the beginning of Guardians of the Galaxy hits a lot of the beats of a couple different archetypes, predominant one being the outlaw.
Yeah, and I think the big part of the appeal of the character in how it was subversive in the first movie was the fact that he was a wannabe. But that never really became clear where the line was drawn, I think, between what he wanted to present and what he actually was. By the end of the movie, you weren't quite exactly sure who he really was. You knew, I think, a lot of really good elements because of his relationship with his mother, which is sort of central to both movies, and his character.
Sorry, can I make this point? I think usually the fridged mom trope is like generally badly used. In these movies in particular, it transcends its own trope and is genuinely really good. Like, Meredith is the moral backbone of both movies.
Yeah.
And she comes through so clearly. The thematics, the characters, the decisions that they make, and like the emotions that are present consistently from the beginning of the first one to the end of the second one.
What the second one really does is break down where Peter's fantasies come from, where his insecurities and his fears come from, and how he eventually transforms by the end of the film to become a completely different person than what he's originally trying to be in the first Guardians movie. Essentially, he's presented in the second movie with a choice between two paths. On the one hand, he has the character of Ego, who's his father, as this person who's kind of like the paragon of masculinity.
Of that traditional form of masculinity.
Yeah, that he has always looked up to in his life. So I think that the whole like Hasselhoff meme is very well done, especially in the casting of Kurt Russell as his father, because...
Sidebar, Kurt Russell does a great job in this movie. Like, his performance in this movie, one of the best MCU villains. He's so hateable.
Well, I think what I really liked about it, after having seen it, that I didn't really realize while I was watching, was the fact that Ego as a character is so overtly appealing when you meet him, because you're so used to... It's like a meta-commentary on the media in general, in movies. You're so used to him being that kind of charismatic leading guy who, he doesn't really have a care in the world. He's
charming, saying the right thing. He's not overtly misogynistic, but he kind of is.
What I liked about Ego's character was that you, as a viewer, at first you knew that there was something off about him, but you couldn't help but like him, which is exactly what the characters in the movie are going through. And then once you realize what's wrong with him, you still aren't quite sure of who he really is. At the end of the day, even after having watched the whole movie, you don't really know what was behind all of that persona.
Yeah.
Right? Who he really was. Was he like a brain in a jar? Like, what was he? You don't know. And I think a big part of that is the point of the film, right? Is that person, that persona, doesn't actually have substance.
It's not real. It's a fantasy, which Gamora says in she and Peter's big argument.
A lot of the uncanny valley elements of the weird planet that they're on is, I think, intentional, because it's supposed to be strange. Philosophy that Ego peddles isn't in any way a viable way to live for a human being. For him it is, because he's some weirdo thing. In particular, he is trying to turn Peter into himself. He's trying to manipulate Peter into choosing his path, which he thinks is the right path. Now, as a part of that, I think that you never really quite know, and I interpret it this way, but I don't think you really quite know whether or not Ego really loved Meredith. I think from how I read the movie, it's supposed to be that he did think that he loved her, but his conception of love is very twisted. And so in his version of things, Meredith was his love because he had such a great time with her. He felt free with her, When he says that, I had to kill her or else I wouldn't have been able to fulfill my purpose, I don't think he's lying. I think you could interpret it that way if you want, but I think that at the end of the day, he doesn't really see her as anything more than as like a selfish object to be desired and then removed when he no longer, like when it's no longer in his best interest.
Yeah.
And that's really well captured with that song Brandy, where I really like the part where he's explaining the meaning of the song to Peter. It kind of says with a little bit of disdain in his voice, but kind of still genuinely, he says the line where he's like, oh, what a good wife she would be.
Yeah.
And that kind of tone is like, she would be a good wife, you know, she would like clean and cook and be there for me and make me happy, but he's
I
too
am
good.
not accountable to her.
He doesn't want to be tied down, right? And that's such a classic...
I have no responsibility in this situation.
Well, that's such a classic leading man trope vibe, right?
Yeah.
Where, you know, he can have all these dalliances, but at the end of the day, he's the leading man. He can't be tied down.
Yeah.
He has to be too cool for a relationship, for love, you
Yeah.
know? And that's what Peter is trying to present himself as in the first movie.
The movies very directly and consistently reference a time period of pop culture in which
that was very popular.
That was the archetype that was constantly present.
Which is why I think the casting of Kurt Russell is such a good meta
meme. But, you know, as you said, like, Peter's obsession with Knight Rider and the movies that he references and even the songs that he likes all reflect that particular attitude. And I bring up the casual misogyny not because Ego in particular is consciously being sexist, but because that time period was very casually sexist. The role of the leading man versus the love interest, or the, you know, like, think of James Bond. It's telling that, like, despite the fact that he has no consciousness of it, even in his interactions with a character like Gamora, Gamora is the deadliest woman in the galaxy, but he dismissively, like, refers to her as sweetheart.
That's what he's trying to turn Peter into. He's essentially trying to kill everything that his mother,
that Peter's mother had
in him, right? Which is her, like, love and humanity. It's both literally Peter choosing to be human and also metaphorically him choosing to be human in what it really means to be a person and not just a persona. He even manipulates Peter's worst impulses and gets him to treat Gamora like she owes him something, right? Which is something that he doesn't really do prior to
like having been on Ego's planet for a significant period of time. Yeah. At the beginning of the movie, they operate on quite equal footing, and there's a consistent give and take. There's
a really nice contrast there that shows that desire and those personas, fed a lot by the pop culture he engages with, are still within Peter, and he can fall into that when it's reinforced within him. This is his first outcome, I think, of the two outcomes. He can choose to retreat into this purpose and identity that is defined by his trauma. What he's being told to embrace by Ego is this kind of independent, selfish masculinity that he depended on to survive, denying his hurt and his emotions and his deepest fears about his abandonment and about his insecurity and about his vulnerability that he experienced, both because his father left, because his mother died, and because of his experience with the Ravagers. He's denying himself the opportunity to forget about that, and instead he's covering it up with a persona. He's covering it up with selfishness and bravado, in direct contrast with this.
So that's his first choice. That's the one direction that he could go in.
Exactly.
In the format of the movie.
The choice that's made in direct opposition to this, which is to embrace an identity that's sourced from the formative, unconditional love of his mother. And that is built around being a guiding light for other people, staying true to his family, despite their flaws. A great example of that in a more romantic sense is him loving Gamora without expectations in return.
Yeah.
And that kind of universal humanity is what allows him to not feel alone and vulnerable. And so when he does this choice, instead of hiding his trauma, he's letting it go of it. And this is what helps him heal. And it also helps him heal others. Family, his community, they're all trying to be better and to support one another. I really like the scene that has that kind of quiet flashback where he remembers all of the experiences that he's had with all these people, his life, not necessarily just because they gave him pleasure or made him happy and that they were useful, but that he genuinely feels a sense of responsibility and obligation and devotion to these people in his life because of their devotion to him, right? And that's kind of the switching moment where he makes his choice and he rejects, quite literally, Ego.
First of all, the experience of that scene in the movie theater, the opening bars of Fleetwood Mac's The Chain, unmatched poetic cinema. Second, in the context of recovering from cycles of trauma and abuse and being able to push past them, I've always found that it's really interesting that Yondu is the character who pushes Peter to accept his own vulnerability and accept his capacity for love and draw on his capacity for love, which comes from his mother. Yondu has, up until that point where he says, I don't use my head, boy, I use my heart. Up until that point, Yondu has been the character who has been instilling in Peter, very parallel to Ego.
Yeah.
Vulnerability is bad. Tying yourself down to one person is bad.
You're alone in the world.
You're alone in the world. You have to be tough or we'll eat you, Have very directly been feeding into the toxic sense of masculinity that pushed into Peter's persona.
Well, a big part of Yondu's redemption isn't just his literal sacrifice. It's also that. It's his ability at the end to help Peter transform.
Yeah, to help Peter transform.
In a way that he never could.
Exactly. Maybe it'll be helpful if we give a general overview, the idea of trauma and traumatic experiences. In the past decade or so, the definition of traumatic experiences in healthcare and mental health care has been expanded to include a wider diversity of experiences. Generally speaking, it's any horrifying or shocking experiences that change people's basic sense of values and reality. So your fundamental assumptions regarding your personal safety, your mortality, and the logic of the world around you are suddenly shaken. The type of event or experience that can cause this can be anything from disrupted attachment to a parent in childhood to getting bullied once in high school to a car accident to sudden loss of a loved one, experiences of microaggression or racism, all the way to severe domestic abuse or sexual assault, or being in a war zone or a conflict, or it's a very wide range. Now, children being far more sensitive to changing environments than adults means that children are more at risk of being traumatized by things that to an adult's mind might be relatively minor. A lot of a more social determinants of mental health perspective suggests that mental illnesses emerging in adolescence or adulthood can be traced back to small or large disruptions of relationships or environmental factors in childhood. Another thing that is important to talk about is the idea of intergenerational trauma, which is something that is related to a passed down experience of what was just described, so a sudden shock to an understanding of the logic of the world around them. This can be experienced by racialized populations or descendants of populations that have experienced colonization, a variety of different countries in the world, populations who have lived through wars and conflicts, populations whose ancestors were displaced, whether for opportunistic reasons or by force, whether you're a refugee or just an immigrant. I mean, basically the point here is that if you look at people who fit into the above categories, you are pretty much looking at literally everyone. And I want to drive this point home because I think that sometimes when we talk about population trauma, the pop culture conversation around it often leans towards only people who are of a racialized minority, or only people who are part of indigenous populations, or only people who are part of XYZ group have experience with this. But if you look at the history of all countries throughout the world, at some point in their history, people have been displaced, or people have been, caught up in a conflict, or people have been run from their homes. Even if you look at relatively socioeconomically well-off populations of white people in North America, most of their ancestors were participants in World War I and World War II, which have historically been documented to have really severe effects all the way down the line. I mean, and this is ignoring Vietnam or Korea or all those other wars, the Cold War, that they've had consistent long-term generational effects on alcohol abuse, drug abuse, domestic violence, general PTSD that has influenced generations after generations of people. Basically, my point here is that this is not a one group or another group thing. Obviously, there are degrees and there are extremes to the difference of experience that has occurred, but
the concept of trauma
is a universal experience. Our accumulated responses to adversity and what we do or do not do in reaction to these will most certainly affect our overall well-being. And traumatic experiences, I think it's important to note, can be highly subjective, as can be the effects of those experiences on people as they continue their life. I bring this up because the human experience is holistic, and as such, discussing ways of dealing with trauma purely from like a medical or diagnostic perspective is inherently limited. And this, I think, is where story comes in. The motif of characters who have experienced severe adversity or trauma is seen pretty commonly across both superhero or archetypal stories in general. One thing to talk about first, before we get into the structure of Guardians and exactly how it hits all the beats, I keep seeing takes on this that are misguided, in my opinion. How stories like a superhero story or work of children's literature or any kind of archetypal myth or that kind of story tackles the idea of trauma and trauma recovery.
And I was just thinking, like, okay, Batman's parents dead, like the classic Uncle Ben's murder, all that kind of stuff. There's this line in Community where Abed says, so basically we're all each other's Uncle Ben's murder, and then Troy says, and we're all Spider-Man.
But he's right, though.
And I was like, yeah, that's pretty accurate.
He's right, though. The idea of a person who has just been dealt like a really terrible hand by life out of the blue, and now they have to overcome it and deal with it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this.
Like, the concept of Uncle Ben's murder is so universal, even though it doesn't actually literally have to be Uncle Ben's murder. You know what I mean?
Yes. I think trauma or adversity in stories is often used as a symbol of that universal experience of the human condition, which is adversity and collected adversity. Now, I think that this is in part because it's very difficult to talk about trauma from a medically accurate or medicalized perspective in story, because individual experiences of trauma are so subjective, and the intricacies of like a therapeutic intervention or a diagnostic intervention are also subjective and changeable, and they're contested even within academic circles right now. Like, mental health care is still a field in its infancy in many ways. So if you're going into a story, especially a story that's like meant to be a universal tale and not like a psychological or gritty, grounded, deep dive into the psyche of a person, it's kind of unreasonable to expect the story to get into a 10-step psychiatric program for this character whose, Uncle Ben was killed. Do you know what I'm trying to say here? That being said, there are certain universal principles or patterns in the human experience on a psychological, sociological, and spiritual level that can be discussed in story. This goes back to Tolkien's commentary on the parabolic nature of story that we brought up in the very first episode, in the Lord of the Rings episode, when we were laying down our framework. The full quote reads, "The significance of a myth is not easily to be pinned on paper by analytical reasoning. It is at its best when it is presented by a poet who feels rather than makes explicit what his theme portends, who presents it incarnate in the world of history and geography as our poet has done. Its defender is thus at a disadvantage. Unless he is careful and speaks in parables, he will kill what he is studying by vivisection, and he will be left with a formal or mechanical allegory, and what is more, probably with one that will not work."
He's basically saying, in a very rudimentary sense, show, don't tell.
Yes.
But more than that, he's saying that when you try and tell too explicitly, when you try and create a really mechanical, formal, one-to-one analogy, it's often not going to match with the world one-to-one, and then it starts to fall apart.
Because the world is super complex.
Yeah.
Like it's constantly changeable, constantly transient, and again, hugely subjective in things like this, in things that are very experiential.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is also interesting, particularly because Tolkien lived through World War One, and much of his thematics in Lord of the Rings trace back to his experiences in the trenches and his fellow soldiers' experiences in the trenches and the general trauma of war. So he's not coming, his takes on storytelling are not coming from the perspective of someone who has not experienced any kind of suffering. He also says that legends and myths are largely made of quote-unquote truth, and that the process of myth-making is a tool for guiding humanity towards a greater understanding of, and I'm paraphrasing here, but a more central or universal point of truth, which in his case, because he was Catholic, was God. Why are we...
Speaking of Catholics.
Speaking of Catholics. No.
We'll get into the legend that is Matt Murdock eventually.
We will. But, okay, so why are we talking about this? The presence of trauma and traumatic experiences in a story can be simply a reflection of certain commonalities of human experience of adversity that act as like a basic canvas for exploring universal ideas of human hurt, love, resilience, courage, hope, morality, endurance, joy, community, etc.
Etc.
And this is especially true of children's stories, whether it be children's literature or superhero movies. Stories like Percy Jackson, Harry Potter, Bucky's arc in Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
That's the holy trinity of children's lit. Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, and Bucky's story from Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
It's the first thing that jumped to my mind. The reason why I bring that one up is because his arc has been criticized for not being detailed enough, not making it feel realistic, because somebody who has been through that kind of trauma is not just going to be okay.
No, I get your point.
I think there's a misunderstanding there that comes back to this point, that a story like that uses the place that the character is in as having experienced unconscionable trauma, right? That's not something a normal person in normal real life has experienced. And using it as a template to discuss or explore more universalizable,
more relatable
elements of the human condition, which in that case are you can't recover from trauma on your own. There is an element of it that involves looking out to other people, finding ways to be of service to the people around you, finding a community. Technically, the Guardians should all on paper be in intensive therapy, but the purpose of the story is not to put them through therapy. It's to be universal in its themes. Not everyone has been, non-consensually surgically reconstructed by an abusive transhumanist in their childhood, right? Honestly, not everyone has lost a beloved parent, but everyone has experienced some degree of hurt or loneliness or loss. Some people it'll be acute, for some people it's generational. Everyone, whether consciously or not, is trying to figure out how to overcome that and move forward to become better people. Just a quick disclaimer, by no means is this dismissing the importance of therapy or diagnostic treatment as a method of healing from traumatic experiences, nor is what we've been talking about here dismissing the value and importance of telling stories that very directly and explicitly focus on the science behind that, or the experience of people with a process of going through therapy, receiving treatment. As always, I think our philosophy here is that a large diversity of types of stories, of story structures, of story metaphors, types of storytelling is very important. Telling stories like those I just described in an accurate and resonant way is very important to sense-making and meaning-making around people's experiences with those things. Different stories, as I said, have different functions and approaches, and in more recent years especially, in my experience, audiences don't seem to engage well with stories where a particular human experience or situation, in this case, trauma, we talked in the last episode about monarchy. how those things are used as a channel to explore a universal principle that all human beings can learn from and relate to. To wrap this up, there's an interview wherein she's asked the question, how do you survive in a world where we're all victims of something? And she responds with, quote, sometimes you don't survive whole, you just survive in part. But the grandeur of life is that attempt. It's not about the solution. It's about being as fearless as one can, behaving as beautifully as one can, under completely impossible circumstances. It's that makes it elegant. Good is more interesting, more complex, more demanding. And I think that is the position and approach to trauma and adversity or the collected adversity that is an intrinsic part of human life that many archetypal stories take. They come and say, it's not about solving or resolving what has happened to you. It's about that journey of the characters, as we talked about in the Spider-Man episode, being, fearless in the face of this profound and impossible adversity, or at least figuring out how to be fearless, figuring out how to be good.
Now that we're finally going to get into it, this is the connecting point of commonality between season 3 of Daredevil and Guardians 2 in particular. It's this common thematic, I think, about how one who has trauma and has gone through adversity comes to transcend it or heal and strive for something greater. Not necessarily immediately become something better.
Nor even completely recover from their trauma.
But to orient themselves and improve as much as they can.
Exactly.
That concept that she brings up about as being as fearless as one can be, I really like the thematic at the end of season 3 of Daredevil, where they've used the tagline of to become a man without fear. It's the same idea.
Maybe we can come back to that trifecta take on the main thesis of Guardians.
Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, Bucky from Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
We should coin that. I think that it's got something. Okay, so deserving of love, capable of love, responsible for loving. Let's talk a little bit about deserving of love. If we look at the structure of the story, and not just volume 2, both volume 1 and volume 2, each character is kind of trying to break free from a cycle of suffering or abuse.
At this point in the story, in the second movie, they have a degree of freedom, but they're still all emotionally and as a result in their choices, they're still frozen in time to a certain degree with the problems and traumas that they have, right?
That they're carrying with them.
And that the movie involves a lot of catharsis with each character in their own respective way.
There's a bit of a Russian doll thing going on where some characters' abuse is couched within other characters' abuse. So, like with Yondu and Peter, for example, Yondu's treatment of Peter is not a healthy parent-child relationship. As you see in the story, a lot of it has affected Peter negatively in the way that he's capable of processing his emotions, his own trauma after the loss of his mother, all the way into adulthood. There's a lot of baggage that Peter carries as a result of being abducted by Yondu and the way that Yondu and his crew treated him. But at the same time, Yondu himself, which is made a lot more manifestly clear in Volume 2, was sold into slavery as a child by his parents and was also treated terribly over his childhood. Sidebar, Michael Rooker's delivery in both of these movies, of all of his lines,
iconic.
Is so incredible. I have never seen a man commit that hard to line delivery, possibly with the exception of Jeffrey Rush as Barbossa in Pirates of the Caribbean. Same energy, different twang. Yeah. Like, I love the line in Volume 1 where Yondu is like,
you always did have scrote, boy.
And I love that line too, but I was talking about the other one where immediately before that line, he says, is that what she's been filling your head with? I can't do the
sentiment
rot in your brain like maggots. That idea of any form of vulnerability is bad, is evil.
Well, because in that context, it's a signal that, hey, come kill me. It's a signal that you're too weak to survive.
You're too weak to survive. Exactly. And so Yondu has that toxic mindset within him as a result of his experiences, and he has now impressed that upon Peter.
Yeah.
Similarly, Gamora and Nebula, their experience with Thanos as being their primary abuser, Nebula having all of this baggage because Gamora was trying to survive, and as a result did not recognize. And I think, like, obviously there are different degrees of responsibility. Like, Yondu was an adult when he found Peter, so technically he's more responsible for the crap he piled on Peter than Gamora, a child, is for what happened to Nebula, a slightly younger child. Like, it's there's relativity there, but it's the same principle of, you know, sometimes...
Well, Gamora was thinking only about herself. She didn't stop to realize that her success meant Nebula's suffering, essentially.
Exactly. Her survival meant Nebula's continued abuse and suffering.
Yeah.
Not that it meant that Gamora wasn't also being abused, right?
Yeah.
So I think that, but the core of it is that all of these characters are trying to overcome that. They've been, in the structure of the story, they've been trapped in these spheres of, this terrible thing happened to me, and I have inadvertently, you know, continued spreading this terrible thing to the other people around me because of my choices and my behaviors and my general internal state. And yet there's an understanding in the events that happen that every single one of them is deserving of humane treatment and of being shown love, even when they are acting horribly. I love Rocket and Peter's exchange at the very end of Volume 2, which is framed by Yondu's funeral and Yondu's relationship with Stakar, Sylvester Stallone, what an iconic cameo, and all the other Ravagers, where Rocket says, oh, they still came, even, what's the line, even when he pushed everyone away and stole batteries he didn't need?
Yeah. After Rocket says that, Peter's response after everything that's happened is of course they would.
Of course they would, yeah. And I think that that's really important, both to Rocket's journey and also as a reflection of how much Peter has grown.
He comes to that conclusion
over the course of the movie.
The course of the film, because throughout the movie the main tension is between him and Rocket in terms of the dynamic of the group.
He and Gamora have their big fight and he pushes her away while she is also pushing him away. And then she comes back to save him. Gamora refuses to hurt Nebula despite Nebula coming to kill her. Rocket comes back to look out for everyone, even though he pissed everyone off and they were all pissed off at him. Yondu comes back for Peter, even though Yondu pushed him away and then Peter pushed Yondu away.
Yeah.
I love the metaphoric and thematic structure of Volume 2, where Rocket steals the batteries at the beginning, and then at the end, Ego calls Peter a battery, and Yondu stole a battery that set the chain reaction for all of the events of the movie.
That's a big
ring. And there are so many parallels drawn between Rocket and Yondu throughout the course of the movie.
Yeah.
And it's like exactly the same, except Rocket literally stole batteries and Yondu...
buy some batteries? I still think Dave Bautista deserves an Academy Award for that laugh.
Correct.
I feel so bad now that I watch it because apparently it really hurts him to do it.
Yeah.
So it's always like bittersweet when I watch movies. I'm like, oh, it's so good. But I feel for you,
the
man.
sacrifice he has made for us all.
Yeah, I know.
So Rocket and Peter's exchange at the end of Volume 2 makes me think of a passage, and this is kind of hilarious because we're talking about a movie with multiple dick jokes in it, and I'm bringing up Dostoevsky. But it makes me think of a quote from Dostoevsky's The House of the Dead. Once again, my man Fyodor knows what he's talking about. He says, quote, "Everyone, whoever he is and however lowly the circumstances into which he has been pushed, demands, albeit instinctively and unconsciously, that respect be shown for his human dignity. The convict knows he is a convict, an outcast, and he knows his place vis-a-vis his superior officer. But no brands, no fetters will ever be able to make him forget that he is a human being. And since he really is a human being, it is necessary to treat him as one. Merciful heavens, human treatment may even render human a man in whom the image of God has long ago grown tarnished. It is these unfortunates that must be treated in the most human fashion. This is their salvation and their joy." This principle, interestingly enough, is like one of the main themes of the Guardians movies.
Yeah.
That people who are in many ways broken because of how horrible their circumstances have been, and as a result treat others horribly, are in fact the most deserving of human treatment and of someone to come and say, like Dostoevsky, again, because of his context, uses the terminology, the image of God. But I would interpret that as he kind of equivocates it with a fundamental sense of like potential for goodness and humanity. And in Guardians, there's this constant motif of a character will recognize that another character has it in them to do good, to be good, despite the fact that up until that point, all of the choices they've made have been selfish.
In Daredevil, there's that scene where Sister Maggie is talking to Karen about Matt, and she talks about how all his life he's been abandoned and hurt, and when he's at his most vulnerable, his instinct is to push people away and to lash out, and that's the point at which he needs someone to hold on tightest, right? He needs someone to not abandon him so that he can see that he's wrong.
Obviously, of all of the arcs in the movie, Peter literally drawing on memories of his love for his family to fight back against ego is the most obvious example of a character who's been traumatized still being capable of love.
He doesn't do that in isolation. Everyone comes to his aid first.
Exactly.
They all show that they aren't willing to give up on him.
Exactly. And then within that everyone coming together over the course of the movie, there have been smaller sub-arcs, right, with Gamora and Nebula showing each other that they care, or Yondu and Rocket finding common ground, being able to make the decision to come back and help their friends. At the end of the film, Gamora's ability to acknowledge the unspoken thing between her and Peter, even in Drax's relationship with Mantis, it reminds the audience that though he's lost his daughter and his wife, and that he's so often like this kind of wall of a person, he is filled with profound emotion, and he is still capable of transferring that emotion and that care to another person, however clumsily. I love that scene with him and Mantis by the pool. Consistently throughout the movie, there is so much proof that amidst the struggle that these characters have been through, not only are they capable of that love, but they are each in turn capable of triggering the ability to love in one another. Daredevil's, that whole sequence at the end where Matt finally confronts Fisk and beats him and then has like a small mental break while he's screaming at Fisk. Poetic cinema once again. But Matt's "you don't get to destroy who I am" line, I think, is very powerful in the context of a character who has undergone so much trauma and has faced so much suffering. And I think that connects directly to Guardians. That also connects very closely to Peter, because Peter is a character who is deeply, profoundly emotional, has a lot of feelings in his heart. He has a lot of capacity for love. All of his traumatic experiences have forced him to suppress that and push who he is away and down. Peter rejects ego, and that reflects this directly. Peter's true self is a person who is just naturally and inherently very loving.
Whereas in Guardians, you have one character being torn in two different directions. Daredevil sort of shows the same journey, but for two different people going in opposite directions. Matt Murdock as Daredevil, and Dex as Poindexter playing Bullseye. Their baseline has a lot of commonality. Both characters, they have a lot of trauma, like childhood. They both have
like the Guardians, they have a lot of childhood trauma.
Dex transitions into adulthood where he works this job with kind of strict discipline. He's trying to be a good person. He stalks this girl, Julie, to help kind of center himself about what it means to be a good person. Whereas Matt's life kind of spirals and he becomes the devil of Hell's Kitchen. He's still a good person, but he struggles with the devil inside, quote unquote. But in this particular season, the story has them in reverse roles, with Matt eventually learning how to balance himself while Dex destabilizes and sort of collapses as a person. The show talks about the idea of having a North Star to guide you. I know you mentioned Tolkien. you said he's Catholic, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of Catholic, Matt's understanding of this North Star is that of his faith in God as a Catholic. Dex also sees his own identity in a similar way, with him wanting to dedicate himself to a particular person as his model,
Yeah.
right? Which is what his therapist has told him to do. So it starts as this girl, Julie, who's a very sweet, kind, loving person. And then eventually it becomes Fisk. So where...
Big shift.
Yeah, I know. where Matt sees himself at the beginning of the story as sort of the right hand of God,
Yeah.
eventually Dex wants to see himself as Fisk's right hand, sort of like the devil's right hand.
Yeah.
And there's also this great imagery with Matt's constant struggle against this devil inside, with Fisk being like the literal devil on his shoulder.
Yeah, I love those scenes.
It's so
where
good.
You never actually see him.
Well, he's never
kind
in
of blurred.
focus,
He's
yeah.
never in focus, but he's there talking. Oh,
Dex starts in a place of normalcy and balance. Matt starts the season with his world having just collapsed all around him, right?
Literally.
He's lost his version of God in his mind as this kind of dictator of events and reward and punishment. And, Matt's been traumatized so many times that his understanding of his own life and meaning is very narrow. So when that illusion is kind of broken, he retreats into himself and he sort of decides that, like, my life has no value beyond just stopping Fisk at all costs. I'm no longer a human being. I am like a shadow of a man. He gets super edgy. And I think that, you have Karen, Foggy, Father Lantom, and Sister Maggie that are all really supportive elements in his story. And when he pushes them away, that's when they hold on the strongest. And they're constantly there to help, despite even their own personal struggles that they're facing.
Yeah. Well, they're constantly there to challenge Matt and to offer
push him to be better.
To push him to be better. They offer him their love. They offer him their support. They help him heal, place to live, like all of those kinds of things. But emotionally and psychologically, they don't take Matt's crap lying down. They are constantly challenging him to things outside of himself, to process his trauma in a way that isn't destructive. Yeah,
he feels like it's like the opposite of that old Star Trek meme. Surely no man has ever attained such happiness. He feels the opposite of that. He's like, surely no man has ever been this hated by God. He brings up Job as like,
oh yeah, I love that scene.
A parallel to himself. I've suffered more than anyone else ever could. And he forgets about all the good things in his life. He's completely focused on defining himself by his trauma, right? Defining his identity by someone who has been destroyed by life. By the end of the story, Matt discovers that there is this meta-narrative, and he describes it as, instead of God being like this arbiter of this happens to you because you did good, or you're punished or rewarded, there's this tapestry that you can never fully understand from the human perspective. Whereas from the God's eye view, it's this beautiful, intricate thing.
Well, his understanding of God goes from like an individual person being the North Star to a far more complex thing.
Matt understands how this meta-narrative shapes the outcomes of his life, and he learns that, his job isn't to right every wrong. His job isn't to defeat every evil and, physically be like, oh, this person hurt that person, so I gotta go punish them. He isn't God's right hand like he thinks he is. He's a flawed person like everyone else, and he needs to strive every day to overcome his trauma and his fears to become a man without fear, and to find, the strength and the capacity to serve everyone around him to the best of his ability. Whether that's through his actions as a friend, as like essentially a brother to Foggy, or as a son to sort of like Father Lantom or Sister Maggie.
Who was actually his mother. Yeah,
as a member of his community, through his work as a lawyer, or just generally speaking as a citizen. His journey isn't just that of, a superhero overcoming physical obstacles. It has to do with a human being learning how to be a better person and how to conceptualize their own life in a healthier way.
I wanted to bring up the fact that Matt makes one of the classic blunders, to quote Princess Bride. Matt thinks that he is alone in the degree and depth of his suffering, which is a very human error to make. It's very easy to feel that sense of aloneness and uniqueness in the degree of hurt you've experienced and the trauma you've experienced.
Man lives in the same universe as Thor.
he grows past that because, to a degree, he learns of the struggles of the other people in his life. One of the things that I really like about Daredevil Season 3 is his relationship with Karen, and the similarities that are drawn between them, and the fact that, in many ways, Matt, upon realizing what Karen has gone through and where she has landed, it definitely contributes to his growth as a character and his coming back from his feeling like, oh my god, I am like the only true sufferer in the world. God has abandoned me. Like, Karen has been through some shit. Okay, and she is still trying very hard to fight the good fight and reach out to Matt and reach out to Foggy and maintain relationships and like all of these things. And now Karen is not the most functional person in the universe, but that enduring effort and the fact that, which is reinforced by Sister Maggie, which is reinforced by Foggy, which is reinforced by a character like Ray Nadeem, that even after blundering, even after making mistakes, even after struggling, you keep getting back up and you keep demonstrating that capacity to love.
Which is the classic, like, Daredevil thematic with his father being a boxer. And
exactly.
It's not whether or not you get knocked down, it's like how you get up or something like that. Something, I mean, it's a classic idea. And I think in direct contrast, it's valuable to bring up Dex's arc, because what the story does really well also as a part of Matt's journey is for him to witness how terribly wrong it can go if you make the wrong choices. Very similar to Peter's choice that Ego is presenting him. Dex, at the beginning of the story, loses the structure of his workplace and his world is turned upside down by Fisk. So he's someone with a lot of trauma, and Fisk is essentially just manipulating that and seeking to build his identity on that trauma and his
Dex's
flaws.
Identity. Yeah, Fisk does what we were talking about earlier that we don't want to be doing, which he very deliberately validates and reinforces.
Well, he's doing it the same way that Ego does. Where in Ego's case, he's telling Peter that, you know, you're alone in the world. You're the only one who's like this. No one else can understand you. Yeah. Dex isn't completely evil. I think that's something that's really important in the story, is he isn't inherently had to end up the way he ended up.
Yeah, it's a tragedy.
It was very much Fisk's doing, essentially encouraging Dex's darkest impulses and instincts, and that telling him that, you know, he's better off being self-reliant and just striving to be good at what he's implicitly likes, which is harming people. Again, I mean, Fisk is very much like a classical devil archetype. What Daredevil does over the course of the season is show both outcomes to what Guardians only shows one outcome of.
I don't think at any point in the Guardians story is the importance of accountability dismissed or denied. I think all of the characters are forced to, like, own up to their nonsense. Treating someone with humanity does not mean being nice to them or validating them. In Daredevil, Karen and Foggy don't treat Matt with kid gloves. Yeah. They call him on his crap pretty regularly. Yes, they choose to ultimately forgive his stupid decisions and his hurtful behavior because they are his friends and they love him. But and he shows that he can be accountable for his actions. When Sister Maggie says to hold on tighter, it does not mean letting someone run over you. And we talked about this in the Spider-Man episode.
I think something that maybe clarifies this, even exactly in Guardians and Daredevil, the reason those stories have such strong cathartic elements in their conclusions is precisely because all the characters that are pushing others away eventually make the choice to meet them at that point and to take their advice and to prove to themselves and to their friends that I am willing to engage in a proper relationship. You know, I won't push you away anymore. Yeah. And that takes a while for them to process, but they have to make that choice. All the characters have to meet in the middle for it to conclude with the way that it does, which is in a happy way.
Every character, from Peter himself to Gamora to Nebula to Yondu, Rocket, even Drax, over the course of the two movies, is consistently put in a position where they are forced to acknowledge that they did something wrong and show with their actions that they can move forward. Hurting others because you have been hurt is not a healthy way of living.
I mean, that's kind of like the doy. No, but I mean, it
like
sounds really obvious when you say it.
It sounds really obvious, but it's hard in
yeah.
practice. The line between hurting others on purpose and hurting others accidentally is very blurry.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in today's social consciousness, I have felt increasingly, especially over the course of the past year, that people feel more and more justified in being hateful and hurtful to others because they have experienced hurt or trauma. I think this comes part and parcel with a heavy increase in like an individualistic and entitled attitude. The reason why this is not sustainable is because, as we said at the beginning, everyone to some degree or other has experienced hurt and suffering. And this goes back to that line in the first Guardians where Drax called Ronan and his buddies to come to nowhere, and Rocket gets really mad at him afterwards and says that the excuse of my family was killed is not an excuse because everyone has dead people. Everyone would be hurting everyone constantly all the time, and we would all degenerate into total chaos and destruction, which, you can kind of see that happening. So I wanted to share this quote from James Baldwin. It's interesting to think about hurt or experiences of suffering as a connecting point as opposed to something that pushes people apart or continues a cycle of harm. He says, quote, "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who had ever been alive." In a sense, the understanding that everyone is a victim of something, as was the question posed to Toni Morrison, is, I think, something that can be kind of anchoring. It doesn't have to be a source of despair. It can be an idea of solidarity, an inspiration to be better, to put these pieces together. If we think that everyone is deserving of humanity, and we think that everyone is capable of loving, those things go hand in hand to temper one another and is like a hopeful way of thinking about humanity's potential for progress. At the end of Guardians 2, where Inigo's like, "You'd be just like everyone else." And Peter says, "What's so wrong with that?" That speaks to this idea in the movie that everyone has suffered profoundly, but all the characters are also capable of love and goodness and progress together in a way that Ego is not capable of. He has no humanity. He has none of that within him. It's easy to, in our minds, think it's a linear process of one or the other. So I am now healed enough to go out and heal others. I am still struggling with trauma, so I cannot have human relationships. Or vice versa, where it is entirely dedication of others that will help heal someone from their trauma. Everyone lives in a network of messy, human, independent actors with feelings and emotions and baggage, but also a profound capacity for good that is interacting with the design of their environment and the infrastructure around them, external pressures. The more complex the environment gets, the more difficult it is to navigate, which is why I think the communality of healing starts with situating oneself within a small group, like the Guardians, or, like Hell's Kitchen, or like in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, a small town community of loving, open-minded people. I think shows like Parks and Recreation or Ted Lasso or even The Good Place all have theses that suggest that this is possible even when the rest of the world or the world outside that community that you build for yourself really sucks. Now, of course, this happening in real life is a little bit more complicated and less, for lack of a better word, romantic than what is presented in story. But it's not impossible. The thing that I think is important, which you brought up with the North Star concept in Daredevil, or Peter's mother in Guardians, is the idea of guiding light. In Guardians, Peter's guiding light is the memory of his mother, who represents this narrativized goodness and her love for him. Peter, in turn, can then act as a guiding light for the other Guardians, and, in Gamora's healing process, she acts as a guiding light for him, for Nebula. In real life, I think it's very important for us to search for that guiding light very actively. And I would point out here that while using other human beings as inspiration is okay, relying on other human beings as that light can be problematic because people are always flawed and will always stumble and, exist in a temporal space. You can lose them, which you see this in Daredevil season 3, as you talked about. Dex's North Star being a person versus Matt having this transition between a concept of God as his North Star, where God is just this personified figure who dictates good, bad, crime, punishment, reward, versus God as a complex meta-narrative with certain principles that cohere together and are consistent throughout one's journey through life. In our lives, working hard to construct a robust framework of multiple different coherent sources of guidance into something that transcends just an individual or just one particular point is a very, very worthy endeavor. That effort to seek out that guiding light.
And the healing that follows.
An effort that is a universal one and that can be done in the context of community and in the context of family and establishing that tripartite thing of I am deserving of love, so I should be able to accept it. I am capable of love, so I should be able to give it. And I am accountable for my behavior and for my actions.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't the first Guardians start the whole modern trend of using old retro-ish music in their soundtracks more consistently?
I want to say yes.
Or it was one of the first ones.
It was one of the first ones that did it in a really successful and popular way. I'm always just a little bit salty about the fact that people laud other Marvel movies that came after Volume 2 because Volume 2 was kind of under the radar. It wasn't one of their big blockbuster moments. They laud a lot of movies that came after for being like, oh, so #feminist women in roles and like they're not sexualized and stuff like that. I think especially because Ragnarok was such a phenomenon, people were really excited about a character like Valkyrie. Volume 2 was pretty much like the first Marvel movie that had multiple female characters who had relationships that were like central arcs in the movie. These movies do a great job at presenting unconventional female characters who don't fit into a particular archetypal box. Like a character like Gamora, she's ruthless and angry and intense and, socially awkward and soft and nurturing and gentle and motherly and chaotic and hilarious. Like she's all of those things at once.
I also just love Nebula's character. I think she's hilarious.
I think Nebula is one of the best MCU characters. I mean, she was done dirty in
Okay, we're not going to
talk about Endgame. We're not going to talk about Endgame because everyone was done dirty in Endgame. But I love how unapologetically murder body and angry and stompy she is all the time, while still being a character who has depth and emotion and vulnerability.
Oh, also Mantis. Mantis is very wholesome.
I love Mantis. Her complete lack of social skills while being an empath is a hilarious juxtaposition. Again, on the train of the Guardians did it first. I've always really liked how openly emotional Peter is. I mean, we talked a little bit about this. In both movies, the narrative allows him to openly cry multiple times.
Rocket has a lot of emotional outbursts. Mm-hmm. Drax has a lot of emotional outbursts. So does Gamora even though she's a very
pragmatic character,
cold,
yeah.
kind of walled off person.
I fully agree. I think my point was more that I appreciated that Peter as a leading man, and we talked a little bit about his filling the archetypal role of the leading man, but subverting it, cries openly multiple times through both movies. And it's not the, single stoic tear while he stares into the middle distance and, suppresses his emotions. He cries. Obviously, since then, the MCU has been pretty good about letting its male characters have moments of like open and evident emotions.
I can't remember, honestly.
In movies like Spider-Man Homecoming or Black Panther or in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, like there are multiple scenes where
I guess, yeah,
a guy will cry openly even though they're like the superhero.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. Even Vision cries in Infinity War.
Even Vision cries, but at the time when they first came out, especially the first one in 2014, that wasn't really a thing.
Yeah, I think when you juxtapose this movie with like Age of Ultron or, you know, Thor the Dark Thor, I guess Winter Soldier too.
Even Winter Soldier, Steve as a character is not a super emotionally available character.
He's very stoic.
He's very stoic, which is fine. Like, you're allowed to have characters like that. But up until that point, it hadn't been common. That was always something that I really appreciated and enjoyed about these movies. Thank you, everyone, for listening. As always,
hopefully you came out of this with a new love and respect for Guardians of the Galaxy 2, a film which opens on a comedy sketch where they talk about their nipples for like a minute.
Look, this movie has no flaws. I know that it's a very flawed movie, but also it has no flaws. They do nothing wrong.
Okay, Daredevil Season 3, though, unironically has no flaws.
Unironically, Daredevil Season 3 is a masterpiece, and everyone should watch it. You don't even have to see the other 2 seasons. I didn't watch the other 2 seasons because I couldn't care less.
Just read like a 5-minute recap online.
And I watched the 3rd season, and it is mind-blowingly good. As always, if you have any comments, questions, ideas, suggestions, etc., I apologize.
I've corrupted you.
I apologize to anyone who hasn't seen Community. We keep making that joke. Please leave them in the comments of the YouTube section or hit me up on the comments section of the YouTube video. My God. You can see that both of us are reaching the end of our rope here. Or hit me up on whatever platforms I've promoted this on. One point that I will make is that among MCU movies, Guardians 1 had excellent wigs, and I respect it for that. Guardians 2 is a lot more stylized, and so it's a lot more obvious that characters
which characters have wigs? Just 2 characters have wigs.
In the first movie?
Ronan's bald, Nebula's bald, Drax is bald, Rocket and Groot are CGI.
Everyone's bald.
Peter has normal hair. It's literally just Gamora's wig. That's it.
Yeah, Gamora's wig is an immaculate
Yondu's
wig.
bald.
But no, Gamora's wig in Guardians 1.
Kraglin, I don't know if he's wearing a wig.
No.
I don't think so.
No, the reason I respect...
Literally just Gamora.
Listen, the reason I respect that movie is because Gamora's wig is an immaculate wig and Peter's hair is his normal hair.
I'm assuming John C. Reilly isn't wearing a wig.
No. Nova Prime's wig.
Okay, true.
Top notch.
There you go.
Look at her and her funky little hairdo. I love that woman.
You found 2 wigs.
2 immaculate wigs, untouchable. They exist in the holy grail of excellently done hair.
Yeah, isn't Korath bald?
Oh my God. Why is everyone in this movie bald?